Hey everyone! So, most of you know me as a guy who makes Let's Plays every other year, but some of you who've followed me a little bit more closely may know that I'm also an animator and designer, so something I thought might be fun to do is take a look at some of my favorite games and discuss all the art and animation that went into bringing that game to life. So, the first game I want to look at is Super Mario Odyssey. Odyssey is an interesting game to analyze because right from the initial reveal, the art direction became a major talking point. I mean, of course it did. Look at these guys. Humans are not supposed to be in Mario games, and if they are, they certainly don't look like that. Of course, there was immediately controversy about the graphics, but it did do one thing. It surprised people. And I think that all ties into the main theme of Mario Odyssey, which basically influences every aspect of the game, including the art. The joy of discovery, of seeing something new. So, how does the art of the game support the theme of discovery? Well, one of the most powerful tools it uses is contrast, so this is pretty easy to see just from the reveal trailer. The reveal relies almost entirely on contrast for shock value. I mean, of course some people don't like the human designs, myself included honestly, but it was still very intentional. Early concept art shows Mario-esque humans populating the city, which would have been really cool, but Mario in a Mario-esque city doesn't really have the same shock value of Mario contrasted with a realistic city. This idea of contrast is everywhere in the game, from the environment, to the enemies, to Mario himself. I mean, the first thing you'll notice looking at the official renders is that we're seeing something we've never seen in official Mario art, which is detail on Mario's hair, mustache, and jeans, and it might seem silly to even notice this, but it's worth noting considering that every other Mario render specifically avoids adding these details. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think part of the reason that it was included for Mario Odyssey was at least a little bit to show some increased graphical fidelity, but it's not like that couldn't have been done on the Wii U. So I think really what it is that Mario's realistic materials combined with cartoony proportions is kind of representative of this contrast within the game's art style overall. It also likely serves to help him fit in with a variety of locations, as he's not quite fully cartoony or realistic. Odyssey is careful, though, not to make everything contrasting. If everything was completely contrasting in the game, that contrast would lose value. So, for example, most of the enemies in the game use a consistent art style, except for one or two. There are more worlds that stick to a recognizable art style, and then 2 or 3 which break that style radically. The locales still all look a little bit different from what we've come to expect, but the developers play with different intensities of contrast. So, for example, New Donk City is an extreme contrast from typical Mario levels, while Bonneton is still a contrast but not nearly as extreme. Other levels sometimes look like they could, for the most part, fit into the general aesthetic of previous Mario games, though these levels often opt to use some sort of element of surprise to differentiate from the typical levels in the series. So let's go a little bit more in depth into the art style of each kingdom. What makes Mario Odyssey so different from other Mario games, and other games in general, is that it feels more like each level has its own art style in mind, as opposed to an overarching art style that ties the whole game together. Bonneton is dark and gloomy and only really uses black, white, and yellow in its colors. You then jump immediately to Cascade Kingdom, which is a direct contrast. It's hyper-colorful and uses much more realistic shading. Whereas Bonneton has a very manufactured, rigid feel, Cascade is kind of the opposite. It's really wild and colorful. Then the game throws its first massive contrasting element at you, the T-Rex. Just the idea of seeing a realistic T-Rex in a Mario game is shocking. I mean, it was shocking enough that it basically served to introduce the game and the capture mechanic to the public in the second official trailer. The contrast is emphasized even more seeing Mario's dumb little hat on the giant T-Rex. After this first big surprise, Odyssey takes it easy for a little bit, so the Sand Kingdom and the Lake Kingdom are more within the realm of what we've come to expect from a Mario game. They're colorful, vibrant, there's nothing too out of the ordinary. They still sometimes play with contrasts like Tostarena and its day-night variants, but nothing too crazy. Then we reach the Wooded Kingdom, and we have our next big example of contrast, or a few examples actually. The first is actually the starting area. This kind of naturalistic look is rare in Mario games. We rarely see realistic trees in Mario, typically opting for cartoony variants, but here we actually see massive realistic tree models. The contrast becomes even more extreme when you go to the underworld. Here there are massive trees, thick fog, and a T-Rex roaming the area. Contrast is used here in kind of a funny way that flips everything on its head. Instead of having a realistic element sticking out of a more cartoony environment, here we have a cartoon tree to contrast with the realistic environment. The game showcases just how different this area is by juxtaposing it with a normal cartoony Mario tree, one I think is actually basically pulled from 3D World. Next we have the Lost Kingdom, which once again serves as a contrast, having a completely different take on nature. Whereas the Wooded Kingdom had a realistic, natural look, the Lost Kingdom heads in the complete opposite direction and gives all of its foliage a plasticine look. I feel as though by this point the game begins ramping up the contrast. So, up after the Wooded Kingdom it's New Donk City, which is another huge contrasting element, possibly one of the biggest in the game. It's also the most realistic area, coming right after one of the most cartoony areas so far. We then get another little break with the Snow and Seaside Kingdoms, right before reaching the Luncheon Kingdom. The Luncheon Kingdom is on the opposite side of the spectrum to New Donk City. Not realistic at all, completely abstracted and stylized. Of course, the game still has to hit you with as much contrast as possible, so immediately after Luncheon, we get our next biggest tonal shift of the game. We go from bright, colorful Luncheon to the dark, realistic Ruined Kingdom. I mean, you fight a realistic dragon here, it really couldn't be more of a shift. You then get two very unique levels, Bowser's Kingdom and the Moon Kingdom. The art styles aren't quite as big a shift as Ruined Kingdom or Luncheon, but they're still very unique as far as Mario levels go. There's also some contrast between these last two levels. Whereas Bowser's Kingdom is loud, bombastic, and busy, the Moon Kingdom is quiet and minimalist. This actually directly mirrors the first two kingdoms of the game, Bonneton and Cascade, although this time the contrast happens in reverse. I'd also like to note that one simple way to compare the art styles of all the kingdoms is just to look at all the birds. Each kingdom has its own bird, and each bird's art style reflects the overall art style of the kingdom. So I mean, that's one way to look at it, if you want to. So, there are all the kingdoms, except the Mushroom Kingdom, but that's basically standard Mario art, at least as far as this video is concerned. So, after looking at all of that, what are the pros and cons of this approach? So of course this is subjective, but I'll lay out my opinion. For the pros, you get a really broad range of art styles and a lot of surprise from the player. However, this can also lead to a disconnected and sometimes uncomfortable aesthetic, which, though intentional in this case, can definitely be looked at as a negative by some. There's definitely something unwholesome about seeing Mario next to this realistic human. It just doesn't feel right. That said, Mario Odyssey is first and foremost a game about discovery and surprise. This concept permeates through every element of the game, from the level design to the music to the art. The main tool used to achieve this artistically, in my view, is contrast. By specifically choosing to contrast various artistic elements, placing cartoony elements next to realistic ones, natural environments next to manufactured ones, and playing with audiences' expectations of what types of designs can be in a Mario game, Odyssey successfully uses its art style to support its theme. So that's all for this video. It was my first time trying something like this out, so let me know what you thought, and let me know if there's any other games you'd like me to discuss. See y'all next time.